The sunset was falling over the trees. A bloody body was lying on the ground. The grass near the body was covered in blood, and everything the protagonist saw was the color of blood. He stood with wide, open, and frightened eyes. A grown man was lying in front of him, and he thought that the only thing left here was death. One of his clansmen was leaning against a tree, and the guy did not understand why all this blood was spilled. A bloody sword was stuck into the ground. The protagonist, whose shoulder was, looked back at the weapon. He looked again at the man whose arm was torn off. The protagonist remembered the fatal blow to his school leader. Then, in his memories of killing a young student who entered our path, the arm was cut off and his comrade. The man clenched his teeth until the blood came. He squeezed his knee with his hand, thinking about the fact that all his comrades were dead. There are dozens of bloody bodies lying on the field, and this was the last squad of suicide bombers consisting of representatives of the elite of the world of Nim, represented by the 9 great schools of martial arts. The clash between them and Chong Ma eventually led to the complete destruction of all life. Blood was running down the chin of the protagonist, and he wondered who was to blame for all this. A man was sitting on a mountain of corpses, and the guy decided that all this was because of the demon who descended from the heavens. The founder of Majo, whose demonic followers painted the world in bloody color. In the lotus position, Chungma, the demon founder of the demonic sect, was sitting. The man opened his mouth with a sigh and said about the Hashin school. The protagonist grimaced, hearing words of pity from his enemy. Leaning on his knee, he decided to get up. The young man straightened up. Blood immediately flew out of his mouth with a cough, and he heard that if he got out of here alive, he would be able to enjoy the triumphant victory for the rest of his life. But it seemed that this was the end for them. The guy grabbed the trembling leg, demanded that his enemy be silent. Dead people lay around in the clearing. When the protagonist heard that he could be proud of himself, since thanks to the incredible help of these people, his sword still caught up with the demon. Chongma extended his hand forward and said that he recognized the enemy's swordsmanship with his name, since his opponent was the greatest of all Hashin followers. The protagonist grabbed the sword, still sticking out of his shoulder. He pulled the weapon out with force. The guy looked at the enemy furiously and demanded that he be silent. He pushed off the ground and rushed forward. The demon's eyes were glowing scarlet. He thought it was a pity. It was like he had 4 more days he would reveal his true identity, which corresponds to the name Chungma. The protagonist ran across the clearing to the mountain of corpses while the demon thought about what must be. This is his fate. After which he said that the follower of Hashin must remember something. He calmly looked at the enemy in front of him. After which he said that this is not the end. The protagonist ran forward with all his might, not paying attention to the fact that he was stepping on someone's hand when he heard that the demon would return again. Chungma Unk's eyes blazed with scarlet fire. He said that when this happens, the whole world will humbly bow before Mu. The sword in the guy's hand began to glow. He ran furiously looking forward. The guy swept his sword, listening to the fact that no one can stop the coming of the demon. The weapon cut the demon's neck, and a bright light pierced the enemy's body. Chong Ma's head separated from his body with a surprised expression. Finally, it fell to the ground. The demon's head rolled down the mountain of corpses. The protagonist took a step forward. He stood among the dead bodies, thinking that the war was over. The boy was breathing heavily. Sweat was running down his cheek. He thought that the inevitable death was approaching him, too. He looked ahead where the dawn was breaking and wondered what would happen to the Hashin school now. The protagonist turned around. He looked at the headless body of the demon and thought that the bones of all the Hashin followers were now buried in this place. The young old people were all killed. The sword was stuck in the ground. The boy thought that only weak children were left alive. The protagonist looked back and wondered if the lives of the Hashin followers were a meaningless sacrifice. His hair fluttered in the wind. He looked at the dawn sky and thought that he could have saved at least one life if he had offered a little more effort, but it all seemed meaningless to him. Many broken weapons were sticking out of the ground. The protagonist fell on the corpses once again, deciding that all this was meaningless since plum blossoms sooner or later fall off. He exhaled heavily, looking ahead. A A cloud of steam escaped from his mouth. The guy's face froze into a stone mask when he thought that he was the 13th disciple of the great Hashin school, one of the 3 greatest swordsmen in the world. His name was the Noble Blade of the Plum Blossom Kaiman. The protagonist thought about the decapitated body of the enemy, and there that after killing Kama, who plunged the whole world into chaos, he plunged into eternal sleep on top of a mountain made of the heads of 1,000 demons. The night illuminated this mountain, and these were the last few lines that the protagonist would leave to this world. A small child was lying in a cradle made of straw. 2 men were bending over him. An old man picked him up. Many students from the school were training on the playground. The protagonist was training holding a wooden sword in front of him. His senior student called out to the boy with an angry expression, and the protagonist thought that his life was flashing before his eyes. He stood calmly in front of the teacher, who reproached him that the boy was first and foremost a Taoist, only then a warrior, and he should understand that strength without Tao is just violence. Then, still young, Chong Yin lowered his head and thought that his teacher was grumbling again, because at that time he was simply bored and he was a follower of Hashin, but failed to fully follow the teachings because in fact he was just a narcissistic fool who received undeserved praise only for his outstanding innate talent. The protagonist's body sank into the consecrated petals. He did not understand why he was so blind, did not realize that everything he had he received thanks to Hashin. An image of a teacher flashed in his head, asking if he regretted it. Without opening his eyes, Kamayan thought that he regretted it all. He remembered his dead friend and thought that if he had taken his studies more seriously, and if he had become a little stronger, perhaps he could have changed this terrible end. Something was smoking above the clearing. The image of the teacher and the protagonist had said with a smile that there was no need to regret, because this is the protagonist thought about the school when he heard the teacher's voice that no matter what happened, Wan's school would continue to exist. A sudden pain pierced the protagonist's body. Screams were heard in the miserable hut. The guy covered himself with his hands from the attacker. Think that it was Kama. Covering himself with his hands, the boy looked at his offender. A shabby boy stood in front of him and said that it was time to stop raving, after which he scolded the protagonist for sleeping here, calling him a poor scum. Carefully, despite the interlocutor, Chunian heard that everyone else went to beg and he was sprawled here. So, the guy did not understand what was happening here. The protagonist looked at the beggar who was twirling a stick in his hands and understood that he was now threatening him. Charmian waved his hand and told the boy to listen to him, since he did not understand a damn thing what was going on. So, first let him stop waving the stick, to which his interlocutor was indignant at such treatment. He smiled broadly. The unfamiliar guy burst out laughing while the protagonist did not understand what was happening here. He frowned, thinking that he was the noble sword of the Plum Blossom Key, so he did not understand what this fashionable ragamuffin was doing. The stranger swung his stick and promised that the protagonist would die today, while he was thinking that he needed to teach this guy a lesson in good manners, and now he would block this blow with a club. The protagonist put his hand forward. Suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise. Not only did the stick not stop, but it also rushed towards his head since the guy did not reach. Kiamayan looked forward in fear and did not understand why his arms were so short. How could they even be so short? Could he not block the blow? The stranger hit the guy on the head with the stick. His eyebrows furrowed as he cursed. The beggar continued to knock down the protagonist, shouting that he did not understand what was happening here, so he would now explain everything clearly. At that moment, another child entered the shack while the ragamuffin was shouting that if the protagonist had gone crazy, then now he would finally lose his mind because the club would set all his brain straight. The new boy looked at what was happening in fear. Cries for help were heard in the shack. The boy left, decided that he would come back later. Chunian wiped his blood. He sat by the pond and cursed his offender, muttering that he hadn't even gotten such a beating at school. The boy remembered the poor man and thought that if he met that poor bastard from Gabon again, who would grind the little boy into dust. His feet were still in the cool water. The protagonist stared into the water. He looked at his reflection and did not understand who he was. The protagonist began to feel his face and think that he did not understand what was happening here. Could this really be reincarnation, which is said in Buddhism, watching him with interest. Kiyomian looked back when he was called. He removed his hands from his face and realized that in front of him stood the guy who ran away after seeing him being beaten. But he asked if the protagonist was okay. The boy looked at the protagonist cautiously and said that their leader was always like this, but today he got carried away. Ken raised a finger and said that he only had one. Then he held up two fingers and corrected himself that he had two questions. The protagonist looked at his interlocutor seriously. The boy frowned in confusion. They stood opposite each other and were silent. Chun-Ian frowned wearily and asked if he was a beggar. The interlocutor calmly looked at him and explained that it was easy to tell just by looking at his clothes. The protagonist squatted down and began to curse himself for being a beggar. The protagonist raised two fingers again and said that he had a second question. He looked skeptically at his interlocutor when he heard if he knew who Chuo was, after which he replied that he thought the protagonist was okay after being beaten, but apparently not very much. Near the lake, the protagonist's indignation sounded about whether they could answer him normally. The unfamiliar boy folded her arms across her chest. He looked at the sky and said that he knew who Chuo was. Kimon looked attentively at the interlocutor, who said that these were demons, the founder of Meiju, who died 100 years ago. The protagonist was dumbfounded. His eyes widened in surprise. Birds flooded in the trees when the guy exclaimed about the past 100 years. He grabbed the stranger by the jacket and began to ask if it had really been 100 years since his enemy died. He pulled the ragged man's face closer to him and asked if he was lying to him. The protagonist frowned. He let go of his interlocutor. Kiyomian looked forward devastated, thinking that the fact that 100 years had passed was madness. And then why was he reborn immediately after death? The protagonist continued to stare blankly. He felt as if he was left all alone in the world. Why was everything so confusing? The stranger clutched his shirt and asked if his interlocutor was okay. He simply looked at his hand, thinking about his school. The beggar boy raised an eyebrow in surprise when he heard the question of what happened to Hashin. Kiyomian was taken aback when he heard the question of what Hashin was. His eyes widened in surprise. The protagonist pointed at the boy and asked if he was a beggar, to which he answered in the affirmative. The protagonist frowned and said that if his interlocutor was ragged, it meant that he belonged to the Gabong school, but he did not know one of the 9 great martial arts schools was Han. And how could this be possible? However, the boy stared at the interlocutor in surprise and asked what kind of nonsense he was talking. Kiyomian thought about the map and heard that there were 9 great martial arts schools, namely Shaolin, Wong, Daenin, Kong, Chong, Aim, Cullen, Gabong, Zhong'e, and Hanam. The protagonist stood with his mouth open in surprise and listened to the story about how the 9 martial arts schools did not have Hashin. The guy thought about the symbol of his school and repeated that the 9 martial arts schools did not have a school. He frowned and did not understand why this was so. Chong Yan grabbed the interlocutor by the shirt again. He began to shake the guy and say that these Hanam villagers from the island joined the 9 martial arts. But this was not the most important thing, because he was interested in why the 9 martial arts schools now did not have Hashin. The beggar boy tried to remember this school. The protagonist's mouth opened in surprise when he heard that if he thought about it, it turned out that his interlocutor had heard that there was such a place in Shunyi province. The protagonist stopped shaking the guy and said that Hashin was located on the territory of Shunyi province, after which he asked if he knew anything about this place. But he replied that he had not heard that Hashin was in the 9 martial arts schools. Hanging on the shirt, the beggar thought. Kian froze when he heard that this school was destroyed. He frowned as his thoughts raced through his head. He remembered his school and thought about how one of the 3 most famous schools in the world, along with Wong and the great Nandong clan, was destroyed. He let the boy in. The beggar boy fell to the ground. Kiyomian opened his mouth in surprise. The beggar boy bruised his head. He looked up at the protagonist, who said that he would not believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. The boy clenched his fist. He stubbornly looked ahead and said that he was going to mount Hashin. The beggar boy looked at him thoughtfully. He rubbed his head and called the protagonist the psycho, after which he told him to go away and go begs if he did not want to get beaten up again. Chun put his index finger forward and said that now he would ask a couple more questions. So he needed to be answered. He touched his chest and asked about his body. The guy looked sternly ahead and asked what the name of the owner of this body was. The beggar boy, getting to his feet tiredly, said that he was a beggar and where would he get a name so he could call himself whatever he wanted, but his name was Cho Sam. Stretching the skin on his face, the main character said that a suitable name for a beggar, after which he asked about age and heard that the poor do not know their age. The protagonist waved his hand and said that now she asked his interlocutor to introduce himself and say the name of the one who beat him. Folding his arms across his chest, the protagonist heard that his interlocutor's name was Kuchul, and speaking his name was John Powell. Chongyin seriously looked ahead and promised that he would repay the favor twice as much and the insult tenfold. The boy looked at the interlocutor indifferently, listening to the fact that he needed to remember the name Chongyun from Han. And when they met again, he would definitely open this guy for his kindness. Turning around, the protagonist walked away. The beggar boy watched him silently. The protagonist turned around and walked in the opposite direction. The beggar squinted when he heard the question, "In which direction is Mount Wan from Shangshi?" Birds flew up above the trees. Chong Yan ran forward. His face was red. He himself thought that he should run, and in his past life, he had not even ridden such a slow vehicle as a horse. The boy's cheeks puffed out from tension. The protagonist fell to the ground about to stop, that he was going to die now. He lay face down on the ground, thinking about how he had only run a short distance and was already exhausted, and that was it. That was all in the suffocated body of this child. So, he didn't understand how he would get to Shunny with such a body. The boy imagined his tombstone and thought that it was absurd if he died on the way before he could even catch a glimpse of Shunny province. Still lying on the ground, the protagonist, young, how would he get there? He smiled awkwardly, thinking that it was time for Kamayan's brilliant plan. The protagonist stood up trying to catch his breath, as he simply needed to gain physical fitness for martial arts. Smiling enthusiastically, the protagonist thought that a commoner could not even imagine how amazing this opportunity was. And even someone who had reached the top might regret it one day. Qian remembered how she was resting on a tree and thought that she regretted that she had not spent enough time on the basics when she was young. He remembered how the teacher dragged him along the ground and regretted that when Shang told him to train, he was too lazy to even pretend. The guy remembered that he was caught drinking alcohol hidden by his elders. He smiled and then decided that he did not regret the last point. After all, Kim Mayan pasted the trees thinking that he would try again. The guy's feet stepped on the thick grass while he thought that first of all, he needed to find a place where he could avoid external stimuli. Putting himself near one of the trees, he realized that this place would be suitable. The protagonist sat down on the ground. He sat in the gilded one and thought about where to start since his mind stored a lot of theoretical knowledge about advanced martial arts techniques. The leaves tore off the tree as the boy thought about his and Hashin School's techniques. Its history is all that is stored in his head, and he knows a dozen different breathing techniques for cultivating qi, if not limited to the Hashin School, then twice as many. The wind rustled in the leaves of the trees. A small leaf fell past the protagonist, who decided to master other techniques. The protagonist's eyes widened, thinking about the principle of 6 interactions. The boy did not remember the textbook with the inscription Lu He's breathing technique. The man handed the book to his customer, and the protagonist thought that books about Luha can be bought at the street market for 500. The coins fell into the seller's palm, and the protagonist asked why he needed to learn a technique that was sold for next to nothing. He exhaled heavily, thinking that this technique was not some kind of cheap thing. Chongyin remembered her school and thought that Luho was studied as an introductory course to the Hashin teachings, and every newcomer who entered Huan began his path with the technique of 6 interactions. The protagonist's hand was filled with strength. He thought that although this technique did not increase the strength of the student exponentially, it completely cleansed his body. It was a basic technique. The guy thought about a tall building, and that there was no need to rush in this matter, since in the end the tower of ability that he was about to build should become beautiful in its grandeur. The young man's vein was filled with blue auras. He thought that now he needed to cleanse the chi energy of this body a little more. The light through the veins reached the protagonist's neck. He thought that this feeling was similar to sifting out displaced threads from a giant piece of fabric. Blue drops hung in space. The energy was now going along the tree trunk, and the guy thought that now there was a complete cleansing of unstable energy. So, collect all the purified energy in the dandian. A ball of light lit up inside the protagonist's body. Its light became stable. Chong-yin waved his hands with a smile and thought that he had succeeded, since the Dante would become the foundation and conductor that would open a new world before him. His legs were tired, and he thought that he was small, but full of energy. He was rolling like a snowball, and this was a stormy stream that no one in the world could stop. So he wondered if he could now run to Hashin. Chong-yin took the first step forward, and he fell again as he seemed to have used up all his energy. Lying face down in the grass, he thought that Luho was of no use as he wanted to use his energy right now. Suddenly, the image of his teacher seemed to appear in the sky and call out to him. The teacher pointed at him and said that he always forgot to use his brain before doing anything, and it was annoying. An exclamation was heard from above the seemingly calm mountains that at this rate the protagonist would never reach the mountain. People were strolling through the market. Two men ran into an alley. They stopped near another man resting. He opened his eyes when he was addressed as an elder. One of the men pointed to the side and said that there was a vagabond over there intercepting their arms, and he was a small child. So all the coins were thrown to him. The elder woman tore herself away from the wall. He slowly started to get up, saying that then it would be worth making his life difficult. His subordinates agreed with this with a smile. They approached the protagonist from behind. The protagonist, chewing a bun, heard someone call him. He did not stop. The guy continued to eat, even when they started calling him names. Finally, the protagonist returned to the men. Continuing to chew, he asked what they wanted. The elder took a step forward and asked how he talks to elders. The man began to warm up his fists and say that he does not know who gave the guy permission to beg here. But since he is still young, then let him. But he must give what is in his hand and everything he collected today, and only then can he leave. And Minion froze and looked back. Then he looked at the bun in his hand. The men began to warm up when the protagonist asked, "Why take away the bitten food? Do beggars really have no conscience at all?" The protagonist rose to his feet, shaking off the crumbs. He began to warm up, surprising his new enemies. Then he threw his fist forward. Chun warmed up her hand and looked at it in surprise. He turned around and muttered that his danshin had not yet recovered, but he thought that this would be enough. The protagonist turned to his offenders and said that now he understood how to control his body, and he was too lazy to mess with enemies. So he suggested attacking everyone at once. The elder began to tremble with rage when he heard that his opponent was not in the best shape now. So he would not be able to be properly. He expressed the hope that the man would not mind if they were slightly drunk. So the elder cursed. He pointed his finger at the protagonist and ordered his subordinates to attack. One of the guys rushed like this. However, his fist immediately missed the protagonist's head. Chun-yin dodged the blow. The hand clenched into a fist. The next moment, he punched the attacker in the jaw. His opponents froze, looking at their defeated comrade in surprise. The protagonist's fist was smoking. The protagonist looked angrily at his opponents and said that he was the noble blade of the great Hashin school's plum blossom. Curses rang out over the roofs of the alleys. The beaten men were kneeling in front of the protagonist. He sat leaning against the wall and asked to address the beggar as lord, to which they corrected him to great beggar. The protagonist was indignant that he was still called a beggar. He dusted off his hands. Kamayan looked at the beaten men and asked if there was a quick way to get to Shangi. The elder looked at the boy in surprise and said that he was asking such strange things. He leaned forward and explained that if they knew such information, they would live like beggars, so they needed to ask something else. Chun-yin said with a smile that everything was clear to him and that it seemed they had misunderstood each other. He threw his head back, laughing, and the tramps immediately joined his laughter. The next moment, the protagonist grabbed the elder by the shirt. He brought his face close to his opponent's and warned him in case they met again that when he asked the question, His opponent must give him a clear answer by any means necessary if he did not want to die. The elder's face immediately became frightened. The beggars jumped to their feet and began to run away. The mountains were drowning in fog, all before the man's authority. He looked at the sky through the window with a smile. Jan turned around when someone called him. Turning away from the window, the man heard Unam come to him. The door to the room opened. Unam looked closely at the teacher and said that nothing special had happened, but a child was asking to meet him. Jan, surprised, approached his subordinate and asked again about the child. Chunin folded his hands in a welcoming gesture. He smiled and greeted the head tier, introducing himself and expressing his desire to join Hashin. Jan watched the boy closely, repeating after him that he wanted to join Huashan. He turned to his assistant and asked if he had told the child that they were not accepting new students, to which Unam replied that he had tried to stop him, but that he had strongly requested to meet. Both men turned to look at the protagonist, who was still folded in a welcoming gesture. Chunian was smiling. Despite his stretched smile, the boy was actually furious, and to find out the reason, one had to travel back a few moments. The stick hit the ground. Chunian, leaning on the staff, muttered that he had finally arrived. In front of the boy were the steps leading to Mount Washan. He grimaced in displeasure, thinking that the shortcut that these beggars showed him didn't help much, but in the end, he managed to get there on his own. The staff lifted off the ground. Leaning on it, the protagonist decided to go to the top. He climbed the steps. His feet stepped on the crooked ground. The protagonist was breathing heavily, but he wanted to do it no matter what it cost him. Chunian caught on a ledge of a rock. He held a stick in his hands. When the stones rolled down, the stones fell, but the protagonist continued to climb up. He looked down in fear, thinking that nothing is impossible if there is willpower. The protagonist forcibly squeezed the staff in his hands. He reached for the next stone, thinking that it would burn Mount Hua. Finally, Chunian climbed the rock. He looked up. The protagonist disappointedly waved his hands and asked where she went. It turned out that the wooden sign was missing from the school. The protagonist grabbed his hair and remembered how Seong wiped it every morning, so she did not know where it could have disappeared to. At the gate to the school, a guy exclaimed that this could drive one crazy. The gate opened. The man asked who had come there. The protagonist looked at the man, who entered in fear, stared at the guy in surprise. Well, he opened the door and asked if he had come or if the protagonist was alone, after which he asked how he managed to climb the mountain alone. Kim Mayan looked at the man with wide eyes and said that he wanted to ask something. Wall looked at the guy with interest and heard the question of whether he was a Hashintoist. With a smile, the protagonist heard that this was indeed the case, which meant that the school had not yet fallen apart. He perked up when he was invited to come in. Near the roof of the school, it was said that they were currently not accepting strangers, but it was unlikely that the boy was able to go down the mountain, and it was not right to leave those who came to Hashin on the street. Unam waved his hand and said that it was very cold here at night. Kanayan opened his mouth in surprise. Let's go to the training ground. He thought about why it was covered with earth and where the blue jasper coating was damaged, to which the Taoist who noticed his condition asked what was wrong. The protagonist smiled at the hospitable host, thinking that he should be calm. Since these were just stones, they probably needed money, so they sold them and said out loud that they had an excellent site. Sweat flowed down the protagonist's face stairs. The guy thought where they were Delhi Golden Palace. He opened his mouth in irritation, pointing his finger at the missing palace. Kim Mayan asked why the place looked a little empty and whether there was really nothing there to begin with. Unam looked up and said that it was indeed noticeable, since there used to be a palace there, and the protagonist thought to himself that he knew, so he was asking where it was. The touched his chin and said that the guest was too young for this story. He frowned, saying that he was ashamed to even remember it, since his honor expressed this. Upset, he looked forward, saying that what is dead cannot die. Unam looked at the guest and asked what he said, but the boy lay down and waved. I will explain that the man only heard it. The Taoist, with his hands behind his back, asked the boy to follow him as he had something to do, and then he thought to himself that in fact such schools are not guilty of anything. On the contrary, they're trying with all their might to save the dying school. He took a few steps forward. Unam and Chongyin were standing in front of the Jade Palace. The deist reaching for the door handle said that Hashin is a mountain of Taoism, so it is necessary to observe some customs. They went out to the Jade Palace to get an audience. The protagonist looked ahead disappointed. Everything was lost in the lottery. He thought about the golden candlestick that the emperor gave to the monk Hadeong. Then he began to think about the scroll written by the monk and the golden tomb. The protagonist looked around. So when the painting that was here, and they disappeared, he took a step towards the altar. His expression was frightened. Chongyin began waving his arms and asking if there had been a flower there before. He looked back at Unam and asked where the flower had gone, to which the Taoist asked how the boy knew about it. He scratched his chin and thought. The protagonist, with eyes wide open in surprise, heard that there was such a flower. It seemed a strange plum made of white metal. Unam smiled and explained that they had sold it. The protagonist's expression immediately became devastated. He heard that this flower was of no use anywhere and was an eyesore standing out from the general decor. And the merchant offered a good amount for it. They sold it. Chong immediately fell to his knees. He remembered Shang and said that the Hashin was destroyed. The protagonist remembered the white plums. The relic of Hashin, like the sword of the celestial, does not shine like gold, does not shine like silver, since it was a small relic that carries the pure waters of Hashin, and they sold it. Unam immediately rushed to the fallen guy, asking if he was okay, and he thought that he needed to sort out this mess as quickly as possible. The protagonist was pushing the floor with his hand. He began to bow to OSU and asked him to let him meet with January Can, bowed with all her might and said that he wanted to enter the Hashin school. At present, the protagonist stood in front of the teachers when Jan wanted all the station about his performance at the school. The protagonist looked closely at the man, listening to the question of whether he knew what the Hashin school was. So she confirmed it. He frowned and thought that the main one would not accept a stranger so easily, but he already had a prepared plan. The guy smiled smugly. The protagonist introduced Chung Jin, who went missing during the war. Chong Yan came up with a legend where Chung Jin fell from a mountain. A lumberjack passing by noticed him. The traveler decided to patch the guy up, but they were too deep early, so he had to stay. And in gratitude for saving him before the OS, he accepted the lumberjack as a student, teaching him Hashin techniques. And he, Chong Yan, then we this lumberjack. The protagonist smiled contentedly. He schematically imagined the system of relations between him and the teacher, and thought that the main advantage was that he could regulate his distribution. If this lumberjack was his grandfather, then he was on the same level as January. So, it would be a mind-blowing plan, but it was unlikely that he would distribute such a young man to his place. Chunlian frowned and thought about whether he could start refusing or asking about the reasons for admission. However, the old woman sighed and said that she was accepting a guest. The protagonist looked at the teacher in surprise. He opened his mouth and asked a repeat, to which Jan said with a smile that she would accept the guy if he wanted it so much. Unam looked at the elder and reminded him of what he had said, but the man said that he had changed his mind since fate was such an unpredictable thing. Chumian continued to stand with his mouth open, thinking that the elder could show at least a little distrust of the stranger. Jan took a step forward to meet the protagonist and said that be that as it may, this guy was familiar with their school. That's why he came all this way. He smiled as they say, do not drive away a bird that took shelter from the rain under a roof and share food with an animal that came to a cave on a frosty night, and they have nothing precious to drive away soap. Unam bowed, listened to the fact that he should give the boy shelter and prepare the initiation, right? To which he said that he would do it right away. The protagonist frowned and was dissatisfied. He schematically imagined how the relationship line falls down due to the distribution. Ziam looked at the symbol of his school. He was dressed in a uniform of third-generation students. Did not understand why this was happening to him. The guy looked around the room and wondered where he was. It seemed like this room was used to receive guests. He went out into the corridor, thinking that he did not understand that this place is now used for temporary residence of those who have not yet undergone enlightenment. Since one did not use such a concept of distribution after that the Taoist shared accommodation with the abbot, the protagonist schematically imagined the distribution of rooms. He closed the door and thought that in any case it seems that someone should live here. Chung Yan stopped abruptly when he was asked who he was. The guy looked back sideways. In front of him stood an older student asking who the main character was that he was climbing into someone else's room, after which she called him a thief. In the corridor, students began to gather asking what happened. The guy who stopped the main character said that this little guy was snooping around in his room. One of the students looked at the others and asked what was going on in the corridor. It turned out that it was their teacher who said that the training was not over yet. They had already started a mess here. The students bowed and sincerely apologized to the master. Finally, the master saw Kamayan and asked who he was, but that the guy introduced himself. The man frowned and said that he must be new to the White Plum Blossom House. Turning away from the guy, the teacher said that it was late and he should rest, after which she reminded him that he must definitely come to training. The main character looked at the backs of students and heard that the others were ordered to go downstairs. The guy who stopped him looked back at him with a start when he addressed him again. The student frowned and said that he would deal with Chumian later and promised that the protagonist would get a good beating from him. Finally, the protagonist was left alone in the hallway, thinking that since these students were his little successors, he would pay special attention to them. The protagonist stared ahead with an unseen gaze. He gloated, thinking that although his definition of paying attention was different from the usual, this was already the student's problem. The moon rose above the school. The guy who had recently bullied the protagonist smiled and ordered him to take something off. Chun looked at her interlocutor in bewilderment and asked again what he needed to take off. The student put his hands on his hips and demanded that his interlocutor not pretend to be a fool and that he should take off his clothes. He smiled and said that this is how men get closer and the protagonist should dance naked while being beaten. And wouldn't that strengthen the bond between him and the older students? The protagonist frowned. Listen, and then if he understood everything, you should undress quickly. Chunian opened her mouth and said that he only had one question.